Hi, my name's Liz Blackburn, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. But I want to talk about something that was very influenced by my time at the MRC, but which is actually now, we call it the MRC, I'm sorry, the LMB. And it now really has driven at root something that I'm very involved in now. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about myself, but without going into any detail. I I was born in Tasmania, that's Tasmania down there. Next stop south, if you keep going south, is Antarctica. And I grew up there, went to undergraduate, did a master's, and then I joined Fred Sanger's lab in Cambridge at the LMB in 1971, at the end of 71. And I was there for 3 years doing my PhD. And I just absolutely loved being at the LMB. And I think you know all the exciting science. The beginning of DNA sequencing was happening there. Molecular biology was just in a marvelous ferment, and I just loved the interactions that I would have daily about science every day. And this was where I learned to be a scientist, how I learned to take in all of the things that matter to us about the way we do science. So I love being at the LMB, but I realized that I probably wasn't for continuing in either the UK or Australia. Now, partly that was because I met my husband at the LMB, and we moved to Yale University, and I was a postdoc there with Joe Gall. And then after my postdoc, I moved first to Berkeley for 12 years and then to the University of California, San Francisco. I'm Professor Emerita now at University of California, San Francisco. Now, coming back to the LMB, as I said, I loved being there, but there were things culturally that, of course, you heard about, and I think Joan Stites particularly beautifully outlined some of the things that women had to deal with back at that time. And in fact, one of the reasons I felt I really wanted to come to the US because, women's liberation and women's issues were very much to the fore. I thought this is where I could really thrive. And it was true, I did. So I won't tell you about my research journey because I want to now take you to the present and tell you about something that, because I both loved doing science, but also realized at the LMB and in fact at Yale and UCSF and Berkeley, I was very privileged. And this has led me into a whole new thing, which a couple of years ago, actually a couple of years before the pandemic, I was at a series of conferences, and these are kind of unusual, interesting conferences, and they're held in a place called Lindau. And the topic I want to take you through is what began as the question, how can we do science better? And most importantly, how can we do science better for all and by all? And of course, this is, as we know, a work in progress. And I love this saying from the artist Hank Willis, who says the road to progress is always under construction. So this, as we know, is always under construction. But here's what evolved. Now, first of all, what is Lindau? Well, here's a picture. I just took a picture a couple minutes ago. This is the weather map. But the Lindau is a place on a beautiful lake. And what happens every year is that there's an international forum for exchange. And it's a kind of interesting format, and I won't go into the history for it. But what it does is it brings together hundreds of young scientists from around the world. Typically, there might be 500 to 700 from 70 or 80 different countries. And a couple dozen Nobel laureates come, and we spend a week immersed, just talking about science, talking, having meals together, just discussing science, going on walks, having, science talks, workshops, talking about science. And so it's young scientists from around the world, very much at the stage when I was at the LMB. And we got talking about how science gets done. And I realized something really important, that I had been so privileged that I had just absorbed by osmosis all the kinds of things about how you go about doing science. But not everybody, even though they may be as talented in science as anybody you could imagine, they may have good access to technologies and so forth, But there's a lot about doing science that is sort of absorbed. And if you're in a really good environments, what we call good environments, but ones where science and good science can thrive, there are certain things that are sort of left unsaid. And we realized that we really needed to talk about what those things are, because not everybody has access to them. So here we were at this meeting, and it was a couple of years before the pandemic, and we started a discussion which then, based on this question, led us into something which we call the Lindau guidelines in the end. And what are they about? What are they about? It's about a sort of ideal as conceived of, and I'll show you the process or tell you the process a bit, by mostly young scientists for what would we want for science. Part of this is motivated by the fact that we all bemoan, and quite rightly, the fact that science has lost a lot of trust around the world. Maybe if there are aspects of science we can point to about the way it's done, this might be one way that we increase trust in science. So the Lindau guidelines, as we call them, the goal is an open cooperative science community where data, knowledge are freely shared, but it's also inclusive, and I'll point out where we explicitly deal with that. And they really grew from discussions with younger scientists, not only on site at the Lindau meetings, but also through some online discussion, open discussions that were held. And I'd sort of initiated this back in 2018, and we called them 2020, which of course was a pandemic year, so they had to be released, first of all, virtually speaking. And they, had a lot of endorsement by Nobel laureates. I think there's over 40 Nobel laureates who've signed on to this, and well over 400, or I think the number is, young scientists have signed on. The whole point is that while they're intended for anybody in science, particularly basic science, especially important for those embarking on independent careers. At the sort of stage where I was at the LMB, and I feel I'd got a lot of good influences through that fortunate circumstance of being at the LMB, but not everybody has the good fortune to be there. So what are the kinds of things that matter for science? As I said, it was a lively, a very interactive process, and a lot of online participation, as well as, in real life forums. We had forums, we had workshops, we had discussions, etc., about this at Lindau, but we also continued the process a lot online. And basically, here are the 10. And if you look at them, I think you'll all sort of think, well, they're pretty obvious, right? Adopt an ethical code, cooperate globally, because we really emphasize the international nature of science. As we know, science is truly international. Share knowledge, publish results, open access. We think that's an important principle, particularly for inclusiveness and not having economic barriers, although there are still some to publication. Share your data, work transparently, truthfully. Think about what reward systems we have, particularly in academia, things that are reward systems which don't necessarily reward what is best for the individuals in science or best for science itself. Support talent worldwide. And that includes, obviously, women, minorities, those who have been, traditionally underrepresented and underserved in science. Communicate this. We think it's really, communication we know is important. If science is to have trust, there must be communication. And of course, give as much as we can to educating others at all levels and in all formats. So a couple more details of this. It's a living document, if you will. We certainly think things might need emphasizing in different ways, but these general principles are ones that everybody agreed on, and but we still want input. Now, I've put the website up there. It's pretty easy. It's lindauguidelines.org, and you can find the details of this there. Now, Lindau, here it is, and it was 2020 we released them, but that was a pandemic year, so the organizers did this lovely thing. They put the goals in boxes all around different places around the town and around the lakeside location. So I thought that was rather lovely that those who at least could get there, and there were no conferences there, but people could walk around at least and they could sort of see these things, the public could see these things. So I thought that was a rather lovely thing, but it's all online. So really what I've talked about here is really how we do science. And I'll just finish with something that I really loved about one of the inputs from one of the younger scientists as we were, evolving this, trying to get these laid out. And, as I said, it's a living document. So, science, how we do it, it's an initiative. It's still ongoing. We'd like it to be adopted more broadly and for people to have access to this. But it's gone, it's pretty well developed in its form as it's useful as it is right now. But what I was going to say was one of the more junior scientists said, oh, right, yes, this is like a Hippocratic oath for scientists. I love that because it sort of captures everything. And I think it's worth thinking about, a Hippocratic oath is something that the medical profession actually, when you graduate, you actually have to, agree to abide by this and make this Hippocratic oath, which among other things, and most importantly, I guess, includes do no harm. And I think a lot of us, as we think of the dilemma for science being used for good and bad, people who come into science, younger scientists particularly, really come in wanting their science to do good. So I thought this was a very nice little summary, if you will, of what we could think of. This is far from being alone. Okay, there are a lot of other initiatives for data sharing, and a lot of initiatives already have been out for ethical codes. And I just put this description up here because there are things like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. There's a universal ethical code for scientists that exists. So we're not saying that this is unique, that all of these goals are unique, but we think they collect them together in a useful place. And I'll just finish by saying, if you're a junior scientist and you're starting your lab or you're making some decision about some process you're doing in science, and you're thinking, well, I don't quite know what's the right way to go about this. The idea is, wouldn't it be helpful to have something that says, yes, in our profession, this is generally the way we think is the best practices to do it. And that's all collected together in this 10 guidelines. And so one will have a set of reference points, which obviously one will have very specific situations to deal with, but we hope that this is a kind of a reference set that will become useful for scientists and particularly for junior scientists. And so I'd be just delighted to answer any questions or discuss any of this further with people. And again, thank you for inviting me to participate. Could someone repeat the question? Someone go to a microphone and repeat the question for me, please.
Reward system?
Yes. Well, one example of the reward system, I think that in many places still has to catch up with the reality of science, is collaborative science is not rewarded as it most ideally will be, given the fact that so much of our science we need to work in groups which share various different kinds of expertise. So we bring complementary expertises to, for example, in biology, the immensely complex questions of biology. We need to have people who bring in a lot of expertises. We can't these days be a jack of all trades and do things well enough to be able to really, really probe some of the big challenges in biology. So I think institutions are getting there, but reward systems that also don't take into account issues like mentoring, how people thrive, behaviors that were tolerated in the scientific community and now, as we know very well, are not behaviors that are conducive to good professional conduct. So I think reward systems are changing, and that was the kind of idea that was in mind here.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, you mentioned communication as part of the ethics, but the responsibility of scientists to communicate their work to the public, not just other scientists.
Yes. Right. I mean, I think that's so what forms can that take? And so when we think about it, communications to the public can be in the form of, where we try and explain simple concepts, where we talk to journalists. It seems axiomatic and self-evident that, of course, we should communicate honestly, we should communicate transparently, we should, make an effort to make what the science is about as clear to people as possible. And part of that is not just, well, there's a lot of reasons, many of which are self-evident, but I think trust in science is improved the clearer it is. If there's a general understanding that it won't be overly self-serving, that one is not just communicating, for one's own benefit, but one is trying to communicate the science as honestly as possible. But I think the general feeling, and again, a lot of this came from the junior scientists, was that they feel that to thrive as scientists, the public does need to have at least some sense of what is science about. Maybe it's the process of science as opposed to the facts of science. And so that was where that came from. I wasn't going to go into great detail in the guidelines. I hope you'll just go online and read them, but you can see the various ways that that's important. Did you have something in mind when you asked about communication?
Well, specifically in the age of misinformation, correct perceptions in the media, especially when journalists will often sensationalize results, and you often don't see the scientists themselves coming out and correcting the narrative.
Yes, and it's often very hard because sometimes the journalists are often very good, and it's their editor, their headline makers, and the journalists plead that they don't have so much control over that. So one just has to keep pushing for that. Yeah, it's a continual process. There's no single good solution. But there are ways that scientists can communicate. Social media, mixed as it is, there are good uses to which it can be put too.
I think we have some questions.
Communicating, actually, I was just going to say, communicating to people, this is the trust issue. When people see that scientists are actually, your neighbor or the person, who comes and buys a coffee from you every day or something like that, sometimes just local humanizing the scientists is very important to do. And so it's communicating being a scientist as well that can, I think, be one of the many ways of increasing trust.
We have some questions on Zoom. Yes.
Yes, so we have one. Adriana says, thank you very much. She has some doubts on goal 4. With the present standards, only rich labs can publish full open access.
Yes.
Being inclusive, which is the roadmap envisioned in Lindau?
Well, it's a great question, and that has been the subject of forums and and workshops at Lindau, because that is very much a very good point, which is that it pays to, you have to pay to play for a lot of these open access journals, right? And one can't always afford that. So there's a lot of different initiatives in place, for journals to kind of step up and have routes by which people don't have to pay, for example, if they can't pay. I think all I can say is that the question has certainly been very appropriately raised, and it's something that needs continually, more effort in it. But it's very real. Yeah.
Right. One last question from an audience. Hopefully you can hear her.
Hi, very interesting. Thank you. Do you foresee these becoming formalized to the point of a legality, an international legality, where people non-optionally sign up to them, be they the headline makers involved in disseminating other people's work, or even the group leaders themselves, overcharging journals, what have you? And do you think that as a consequence, there could even be resistance from within the scientific community because people might be afraid of being formally penalized for poor mentorship and the such like?
Well, I'll start with the last point, which is more and more within institutions, and I believe certain funding bodies, mentorship, for example, is being counted into the reward system. So, you know, there is more realization that this is, if you're lucky enough to be a scientist, which I really feel, you know, I am, and I think many of us here feel we're just so fortunate to be able to be doing this extraordinarily, you know, rewarding and wonderful profession, then there are responsibilities. So that is becoming, I think, already happening. Now, working back to the beginning of your question, they were called guidelines for a good reason, because a guideline is, you know, a guideline. It is not a law. What we're hoping, though this got arrested during the pandemic, you know, we all had some pretty major issues on our minds, right, during the pandemic. And so now I think you know, it's time to sort of start thinking again about this. Now our attention can kind of be, you know, broadened out from the other major issues that were confronting many people, particularly women scientists, by the way, during the pandemic. And so the question is, you know, can they be adopted? There are certain bodies you'll see on the website, certain bodies have adopted them, but it hasn't got very far yet, to be perfectly honest. So we're now just starting to try and, you know, get the word out a little bit more. But you know, whether something is adopted as law, you know, it's like lab safety. I mean, there are certain things that are adopted as law, right? Because you really need to have these, and whether it's appropriate for any of these, that's a bigger question. The idea was for these to be useful for people in the profession, just to have touchstones, as you could say, well, you know, here's such and such an action, but you could say to your advisor or your chairman, I don't think this is very consistent with the guidelines. You know, this gives you a kind of broader set of norms, perhaps, to measure one's behavior. I must say, the junior scientists were really interested in this. I really got this strong sense that not all of us are privileged enough to be in places where we just can absorb you know, all the best kind of science and practices around sciences. And many people are struggling and in different institutions and in situations where they won't have access to all of this kind of thing. And so they won't really have a sense, well, what would be things that in the profession are regarded as, yeah, this is best practice.
All right. There are no other questions. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.